I woke up to the sound of my truck's engine block heater humming its familiar winter tune at 5 in the morning, just like it had for the past 3 years in Fargo, North Dakota. The temperature outside had dropped to negative 25 degrees, and without that heater, my diesel engine would be nothing more than a frozen block of useless metal. I stumbled to the window, coffee mug in hand, and watched the steam rising from my Ford F-250's hood in the pre-dawn darkness. Everything seemed normal until I noticed a bright orange violation sticker plastered across my windshield. My name is Aaron Steele, and I have lived in Pinewood Estates for 3 years now. The neighborhood sits on the north side of Fargo, where the wind cuts through you like a knife and winter is not just a season but a test of survival. I pulled on my boots and winter coat, heading outside to see what ridiculous complaint the HOA had dreamed up this time. The cold hit me like a wall, my breath forming instant clouds in the frigid air. I ripped the sticker off my windshield, my fingers already going numb despite my gloves. Violation notice. Unauthorized electrical usage. Your engine block heater constitutes an unapproved external electrical device and must be disconnected immediately. Fine. $500. Further violations will result in additional penalties. I stood there in disbelief, reading the notice 3 times to make sure I was not hallucinating from the cold. An engine block heater was not some luxury item or decorative addition. It was essential equipment for anyone driving a diesel vehicle in North Dakota winters. Without it, the diesel fuel would gel, the oil would thicken to the consistency of molasses, and the engine would be completely inoperable until spring. I marched back inside and immediately called the HOA office, but of course, they did not open until 9. I had to get to work at my construction site by 7, so I left the heater plugged in, figuring this was some kind of mistake that would be cleared up by the time I got home. I was wrong. When I returned that evening around 6, there was another notice on my door, this time with a $1,000 fine and a threat of towing if I did not comply within 24 hours. Below the printed text was a handwritten note. Mr. Steele, this is your final warning. Disconnect the device or face immediate action. Patricia Henderson, HOA President. Patricia Henderson. The name alone made my jaw clench. She had moved into the neighborhood about 6 months ago and immediately ran for HOA President, winning by default because no one else wanted the thankless job. Since then, she had made it her personal mission to enforce every single rule in the HOA handbook, no matter how outdated or irrelevant. She had fined my neighbor for having his garbage cans visible from the street 15 minutes before collection time. She had forced another resident to repaint their front door because the shade of red was 2% darker than the approved color palette. She was the textbook definition of a power-hungry busybody with too much time on her hands. I called the HOA office the next morning and actually got through to Patricia herself. Her voice was sharp and nasal, the kind that instantly set your teeth on edge. Mr. Steele, I assume you are calling about your violation notices. You assume correctly. Patricia, you cannot seriously expect me to disconnect my engine block heater. This is North Dakota. It is 20 below zero outside. The HOA regulations are quite clear. Section 14, Paragraph 8 states that no external electrical devices may be operated on HOA property without prior board approval. Your engine heater was never approved, because no one ever needed approval before. These regulations were written for things like Christmas lights and outdoor speakers, not essential vehicle equipment. The regulation does not specify exceptions, Mr. Steele. If we allow you to violate the rules, then everyone will want special treatment. I have a responsibility to maintain order and fairness in this community. Fairness. You want to talk about fairness? Half the board members have remote car starters that they use every morning. Those are external electrical devices operated by radio signals. Are you going to find them too? There was a pause on the other end of the line. I could practically hear her brain working to come up with a justification. Remote starters are internal to the vehicle and do not require external power sources. Your block heater is plugged into the community electrical outlet, which constitutes unauthorized usage of HOA resources. That outlet is right next to my assigned parking spot. It was installed specifically for block heaters when this complex was built. Check the original construction documents. I have reviewed all relevant documents, Mr. Steele. The outlet may have been installed by the builder, but the current HOA regulations supersede any original intentions. You have until tomorrow morning to comply, or your vehicle will be towed and you will face additional fines. She hung up before I could respond. I stood there holding my phone, feeling my blood pressure rising. This was not just about a stupid rule anymore. This was about Patricia flexing her authority and making an example out of someone. I had apparently been chosen as her target. I spent the rest of that day researching North Dakota HOA laws and reaching out to other residents in the neighborhood. I discovered that I was not the only diesel truck owner in Pinewood Estates. There were at least 7 other people who used engine block heaters, and Patricia had sent every single one of them the same violation notice. However, I was the only one who had pushed back. The others had either disconnected their heaters or started parking off the property to avoid the fines. That evening, I attended the monthly HOA board meeting, which was held in the community center at the entrance of our development. About 20 residents showed up, which was more than usual. Word had spread about Patricia's new crusade against block heaters, and people were concerned. Patricia called the meeting to order with an officious rap of her gavel. She was a woman in her early 50s with perfectly styled blonde hair that never moved in the wind, sharp blue eyes that missed nothing, and a perpetual expression of disapproval. She wore a pantsuit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, and carried herself with the air of someone who believed they were far more important than they actually were. Good evening, everyone. Before we begin with regular business, I understand there are concerns about the recent enforcement actions regarding unauthorized electrical devices. I stood up immediately. Patricia, you cannot enforce a rule that makes it impossible for people to use their vehicles during winter. Engine block heaters are not optional in this climate. Mr. Steele, please wait to be recognized before speaking. This is a formal meeting with proper procedures. Fine. I formally request to be recognized so I can point out how absurd this policy is. Robert Martinez spoke up before Patricia could respond. Patricia, Aaron has a point. I drive a diesel too, and without my block heater, I would not be able to get to work in the morning. This is not about decorative lights or noise complaints. This is about basic functionality. Patricia's expression hardened. The rules exist for a reason, Robert. If we start making exceptions for convenience, the entire structure of our community standards will collapse. Mr. Steele and others are welcome to apply for a variance, which the board will review according to proper procedures. How long does that variance process take? I asked. Typically 6 to 8 weeks. 6 to 8 weeks. We are in the middle of winter. You are telling me I cannot use my truck for 2 months while you shuffle papers around. You should have applied for the variance before installing the device, Mr. Steele. The device was already installed when I bought the truck 3 years ago, and I have been using it here ever since without any problems. You are inventing a crisis where none exists. Donald Marsh cleared his throat. Perhaps we could expedite the variance process given the weather circumstances. Patricia shot him a look that could have frozen water faster than the North Dakota winter. The process exists for a reason, Donald. We cannot simply ignore established procedures because someone finds them inconvenient. Jennifer White, the younger board member, raised her hand hesitantly. Could we at least vote on a temporary exception until the variance applications are processed? It seems unreasonable to leave people without transportation during the coldest months. That would set a dangerous precedent, Patricia insisted. Rules are rules. Rules are supposed to serve the community, not harm it, I shot back. You are so focused on enforcing your authority that you have lost sight of common sense. The meeting devolved from there. Patricia refused to budge, and despite support from Robert and Jennifer, she had Donald and Susan in her pocket, giving her a majority. The board voted 3-2 against a temporary exception. I left the meeting furious, along with several other diesel truck owners who were equally fed up. The next morning, I woke up at 5 as usual, but I did not plug in my block heater. I was not giving in to Patricia's power trip, but I also could not afford the escalating fines and the threat of having my truck towed. Instead, I had arranged to park at a friend's house 3 blocks away, outside the HOA's jurisdiction. It was inconvenient, but it was better than dealing with Patricia's nonsense. I walked through the freezing darkness to my friend Dave's driveway, where my truck sat with its block heater plugged into his outdoor outlet. The engine started without hesitation, and I headed to work. As I drove out of Dave's neighborhood, I passed through Pinewood Estates and noticed something interesting. Several cars in the driveways were running, their exhaust visible in the frigid air. People were warming up their vehicles before heading to work, which was perfectly normal for a North Dakota winter morning. But here is the thing about Pinewood Estates that I had not fully appreciated until that moment. It was a relatively new development, only about 5 years old, and it had attracted a lot of young professionals and families who had moved to Fargo for work. Many of them had come from warmer climates and did not have the same ingrained understanding of cold, weather vehicle maintenance that native North Dakotans did. They drove regular gasoline cars with modern fuel injection systems that could start in cold weather, but they were not immune to the extreme temperatures. They just did not realize how much they were pushing their vehicles' limits. Over the next few days, the cold snap intensified. Temperatures dropped to -35 degrees, with wind chills approaching -50. Schools closed. Businesses allowed remote work. The governor issued warnings about frostbite occurring in under 5 minutes of exposure. It was the kind of cold that felt almost surreal, where your eyelashes froze together if you blinked outside, and your breath formed icicles on your scarf. I continued my routine of parking at Dave's house and walking to my truck each morning. It was miserable, but my truck started every time without fail. Meanwhile, I started hearing complaints from other Pinewood Estates residents. Cars were struggling to start, batteries were dying, people were late for work or missing important appointments. The irony was not lost on me that Patricia's crusade against block heaters was creating exactly the kind of chaos and inconvenience she claimed to be preventing. Then came the morning that changed everything. It was a Thursday, 12 days after Patricia's initial violation notice. The temperature had dropped to -40 degrees overnight, breaking a 20-year record. I walked to Dave's house at 5 in the morning, my face wrapped in a scarf and my eyes barely visible behind my winter gear. My truck started perfectly, as expected. I drove back through Pinewood Estates on my way to the construction site and saw something remarkable. Every single driveway had someone standing next to their car, jumper cables in hand, phones pressed to their ears. No one's car was starting. The extreme cold had finally overwhelmed their batteries and engine oil, and without block heaters or battery warmers, their vehicles were frozen solid. I drove slowly through the neighborhood, taking in the scene of complete chaos. People in business suits were frantically trying to jump-start their sedans. Parents with children bundled like tiny Arctic explorers were attempting to flag down any moving vehicle for help. The few cars that were running all seemed to be the older model trucks and SUVs whose owners had been smart enough to use block heaters before Patricia's ban. I spotted Patricia herself standing in her driveway next to a newer model BMW sedan, her face red from cold and frustration. Her perfectly styled hair was hidden under a fur-lined hood, and she was yelling into her phone while staring at her non-responsive vehicle. I considered stopping to offer assistance but decided against it. She had created this mess, and she could deal with the consequences. I got to work and spent the morning operating heavy equipment, but I could not stop thinking about the situation back home. During my lunch break, I checked the Pinewood Estates community Facebook page and found it exploding with activity. Dozens of posts from residents who had missed work, missed meetings, or were stranded at home because their cars would not start. Many were pointing out that the diesel truck owners who had been parking off property were the only ones able to get around. The irony was thick enough to cut with a chainsaw. Someone had posted a photo of Patricia's BMW with the caption, "Even the HOA president can't get to work today." Maybe those engine block heaters weren't such a bad idea after all. The post had over 100 reactions and comments, most of them critical of the block heater ban. Robert Martinez, the reasonable board member, had posted a statement. "Emergency board meeting tonight at 7 p.m. We need to address the block heater situation immediately. This is a safety issue, not just an inconvenience." I finished my workday and headed back to Pinewood Estates that evening. The scene had not improved. If anything, it had gotten worse. Cars were abandoned in driveways, their owners having given up and called in sick or arranged rides with the few people who had working vehicles. The community center parking lot was surprisingly full, considering most people could not drive. It appeared that many residents had walked to the meeting, despite the dangerous cold, because they were angry and wanted answers. I walked into the community center to find it packed with at least 60 residents, triple the usual attendance. The room hummed with angry conversations, and the temperature was rising from all the body heat. Patricia sat at the board table looking notably less composed than usual. Her hair was slightly disheveled, and she had dark circles under her eyes. The other board members looked equally uncomfortable, except for Robert, who seemed grimly satisfied that reality had finally forced the issue. Patricia called the meeting to order, but before she could launch into her prepared remarks, a man named Gary Peterson stood up. Gary was a software engineer who worked from home most days, but had needed to go into the office that morning for an important presentation. His car had refused to start, and he had missed the meeting, potentially costing his company a major contract. "Patricia, I want to know what you are going to do to fix this disaster. My car is dead in my driveway. I missed a $15 million presentation this morning, all because you decided that enforcing some pointless rule was more important than common sense." "Mr. Peterson, I understand your frustration, but the board made a decision based on the regulations as written." "The board made a stupid decision," shouted another voice from the back. "My wife is a nurse. She could not get to the hospital for her shift this morning. Do you understand what that means? People depend on her to provide medical care, and she was stuck at home because her car was frozen. More voices joined in, creating a cacophony of anger and frustration. Patricia tried to maintain control, banging her gavel repeatedly, but the crowd was having none of it. These were people who had been inconvenienced, who had lost money, who had potentially damaged their careers, all because of an arbitrary enforcement of a misinterpreted rule. Robert Martinez finally stood up and raised his hands, calling for quiet. His voice carried authority without being condescending. "Everyone, please. I know you are angry. You have every right to be, but we need to address this constructively. Patricia, I am making a formal motion to immediately suspend the block heater ban and to allow all residents to use engine block heaters without restriction during winter months. Furthermore, I move that we issue a formal apology to all residents who were fined or inconvenienced by this policy." Jennifer White immediately seconded the motion. "I support Robert's proposal completely. This should never have happened." Patricia looked like she had been slapped. "You cannot just overturn board decisions without proper process." "Watch me," Robert said firmly. "This is an emergency situation affecting the safety and welfare of our entire community. We have the authority to act immediately." "Donald, Susan, how do you vote?" Donald Marsh, who had been staring at the table throughout the confrontation, finally looked up. "I vote yes. This has gone too far." Susan Crawford nodded wearily. "Yes, let's end this." Patricia's face went from red to white. "This is highly irregular. You are setting a precedent that undermines the entire structure of HOA governance." "No," I said, standing up from my seat in the audience. "What undermines HOA governance is when the people in charge forget that they are supposed to serve the community, not rule over it. You turned a non-issue into a crisis because you were more concerned with asserting your authority than actually helping your neighbors." Patricia glared at me with pure venom. "This is your fault, Mr. Steele. If you had simply complied with the initial notice, none of this would have escalated. If you had simply used common sense, there would have been no notice to begin with. Everyone in this room knows that engine block heaters are essential in North Dakota. Everyone except you, apparently." The motion passed 4-1, with only Patricia voting against it. The crowd applauded, and several people came up to shake Robert's hand. Patricia gathered her papers with sharp, angry movements and stood to leave. "If this is how this board operates, then I see no point in continuing as president. You clearly do not respect proper procedures or authority. I resign, effective immediately." She stormed out of the community center without another word. The room fell silent for a moment, then someone started clapping. Others joined in, and soon the entire room was applauding Patricia's departure. It might sound mean-spirited, but this was a woman who had made everyone's lives more difficult for months with her petty enforcement and power trips. Her resignation was genuinely good news for the community. Robert took over as acting president and quickly organized a plan. The HOA would immediately refund all fines related to the block heater violations. They would also send out a community-wide email clarifying that engine block heaters, battery warmers, and similar cold weather equipment were not only allowed but encouraged. Additionally, they would review all existing regulations to identify other outdated or unreasonable rules that needed revision. The meeting adjourned around 9 p.m., and I walked back through the neighborhood with several other residents. The cold was still brutal, but there was a sense of relief and camaraderie that had been missing for months. People were actually talking to each other, sharing stories of their morning disasters and making plans to help neighbors whose vehicles were still non-functional. I got home and immediately plugged my truck's block heater into the outlet next to my parking spot. It felt good to use my own assigned space again, after nearly 2 weeks of walking to Dave's house. I sent Dave a text thanking him for letting me use his driveway and promised to buy him dinner once the cold snap broke. The next morning, Friday, I woke up to my truck's familiar hum and checked the community Facebook page. Robert had posted the official announcement about the policy reversal at 11 p.m. the previous night, and it already had over 200 positive reactions. People were thanking him for taking action and expressing relief that they would be able to get to work. I drove through Pinewood Estates on my way to the construction site and saw a completely different scene than the previous morning. Block heaters were plugged in at nearly every diesel truck and several of the older gasoline vehicles. People were successfully starting their cars and heading to work. The neighborhood looked normal again, or as normal as any place can look when it is negative 35 degrees outside. Over the weekend, the temperature finally started to climb back to more reasonable levels. Negative 10 degrees felt like a heat wave after the sustained extreme cold. People emerged from their homes to dig out vehicles, clear driveways, and check on neighbors. There was a definite shift in the community atmosphere. The shared crisis had brought people together in a way that regular HOA meetings never had. On Sunday afternoon, Robert organized an impromptu community gathering at the center. He provided hot chocolate and coffee, and about 40 people showed up to discuss the path forward. The main topic was electing a new HOA president, but the conversation expanded to include broader questions about what kind of community Pinewood Estates wanted to be. Robert facilitated the discussion with skill and patience. I think we all learned something important this week. Rules and regulations exist to make our community better, not to make our lives harder. Moving forward, I propose that we adopt a common-sense standard. Before enforcing any rule, we ask ourselves, does this actually benefit the community, or is it just bureaucratic nonsense? The group agreed enthusiastically. Someone suggested creating a resident advisory committee that could review HOA actions and provide feedback before policies were implemented. Another person proposed quarterly town halls to keep communication open between the board and residents. These were all ideas that would have been dismissed as unnecessary under Patricia's leadership, but now they were being seriously considered. Jennifer White raised her hand. I also think we need to acknowledge that Aaron was right to push back against the block heater ban. A lot of us knew the policy was wrong, but we did not speak up. We need to create a culture where residents feel comfortable challenging decisions that do not make sense, without fear of retaliation. People nodded and murmured agreement. I appreciated Jennifer's comment, though I had not been looking for recognition. I just wanted to be able to use my truck without dealing with absurd fines and threats. The discussion turned to electing a new president. Several people suggested Robert, and he accepted the nomination. No one ran against him, so he became president by acclamation. He immediately appointed Jennifer as vice president and began the process of recruiting new board members to replace Donald and Susan, both of whom had announced their intention to step down. Over the next few weeks, life in Pinewood Estates improved dramatically. Robert proved to be an effective and reasonable leader who actually listened to residents and made decisions based on community needs rather than arbitrary rule enforcement. The block heater situation became a running joke in the neighborhood, with people referring to it as the Great Freeze-Out or Block Heater Gate. I thought the story ended there, with Patricia gone and the community moving forward under better leadership. I was wrong. About 3 weeks after Patricia's resignation, I got a call from Robert. His voice was tight with anger and concern. "Aaron, we have a problem. A big problem. I just got a call from our HOA's accounting firm." They were reviewing the financial records as part of their annual audit, and they found some serious discrepancies. What kind of discrepancies? The kind that involve missing money, about $47,000 missing to be precise. I sat down heavily on my couch. You think Patricia stole from the HOA? I do not want to jump to conclusions, but the missing funds all disappeared during her 6 months as president. The accountant found a series of checks made out to a company called Pinewood Property Services. The checks were authorized by Patricia as president, and they were supposedly for maintenance and improvements. But here is the thing: Pinewood Property Services does not exist. It is a shell company, and when the accountant tried to track down the business registration, it led back to an address that is Patricia's home office. So she was writing checks to herself. It looks that way. The accountant is still digging into the details, but the preliminary evidence is damning. I have already contacted the police, and they are opening an investigation. Good. She deserves whatever she gets. There is more. Remember all those fines she was issuing. The money from those fines was supposed to go into the Community Improvement Fund. None of it did. She deposited the checks into a separate account that she controlled solely. That is another $12,000 unaccounted for. I felt my anger rising again, but this time it was different. This was not about petty annoyance at an overzealous HOA president. This was about actual theft, about someone who had abused a position of trust to enrich themselves at the community's expense. The police investigation moved quickly. Detective Sarah Morrison, from the Fargo Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit, took the lead. She was a sharp woman in her 40s with over 15 years of experience investigating fraud and embezzlement. She interviewed board members, reviewed financial records, and subpoenaed Patricia's personal bank accounts. What they found was even worse than Robert had initially reported. Patricia had been systematically stealing from the HOA almost from the moment she became president. The fake company invoices, the diverted fine money, and several other schemes added up to nearly $73,000 in stolen funds. She had used the money for personal expenses, including luxury vacations, designer clothes, and renovations to her home. Detective Morrison came to my house about a week into the investigation to ask me questions about my interactions with Patricia. I recounted the whole block heater saga, including the fines I had been issued. "Did you pay those fines?" she asked. "No. I was planning to fight them, and then the board reversed the policy and promised to refund anyone who had paid. I never sent them any money." Smart. Several residents did pay their fines, and that money is part of the missing funds. We are going to need you to testify about Patricia's conduct and the circumstances around the fines if this goes to trial. Absolutely. Whatever you need. 2 days later, Patricia Henderson was arrested at her home and charged with felony theft, fraud, and abuse of fiduciary duty. The arrest made the local news, with footage of her being led out of her house in handcuffs while trying to hide her face from cameras. The story spread quickly through Pinewood Estates, with residents expressing shock, vindication, and anger in equal measure. The criminal case against Patricia took several months to work through the system. Her attorney initially tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecutor's office was not interested in being lenient. The evidence was overwhelming, and the prosecutor wanted to send a message that white-collar crime would be taken seriously. The trial took place in late spring, after the snow had melted and Fargo had returned to more pleasant temperatures. I testified on the second day, describing Patricia's aggressive enforcement of the block heater ban and her apparent disregard for the impact on residents. The prosecutor used my testimony to establish a pattern of behavior, showing that Patricia viewed the HOA as her personal fiefdom where she could do whatever she wanted without accountability. Other residents testified about their own experiences with Patricia's excessive fines and arbitrary rule enforcement. The accountant who had discovered the fraud walked the jury through the financial records, showing exactly how Patricia had stolen the money. It was a devastating presentation that left no doubt about her guilt. Patricia's defense attorney tried to argue that the missing money was the result of accounting errors and poor record-keeping rather than intentional theft. The jury did not buy it. After only 3 hours of deliberation, they returned guilty verdicts on all counts. The sentencing hearing took place 2 weeks later. Patricia stood before the judge looking nothing like the imperious HOA president who had threatened to tow my truck. She wore a simple dress instead of her usual expensive pantsuits, and her hair was pulled back in a plain style. Her attorney made a plea for leniency, citing her previously clean record and her family circumstances. The prosecutor countered by pointing out the calculated nature of the theft and the breach of trust involved. "Your Honor, Miss Henderson did not steal from a stranger or a large corporation that could absorb the loss. She stole from her neighbors, from people who trusted her to manage their community funds responsibly. She used her position of authority to enrich herself while simultaneously making life harder for the very people she was supposed to serve." The defendant's conduct with the block heater ban shows her contempt for the welfare of her neighbors. She prioritized her own ego and her own power over basic common sense and human decency. That same contempt is what allowed her to steal from these people without apparent guilt or remorse. The judge, a stern woman named Margaret Holloway, listened to both sides and then delivered her ruling. "Miss Henderson, I have presided over many fraud cases in my years on the bench. What distinguishes your case is the particular betrayal of trust involved. You were not an employee skimming from corporate accounts. You were a neighbor stealing from neighbors. You were given a position of responsibility within your community, and you abused that position in every possible way. Your conduct regarding the engine block heaters shows a pattern of prioritizing your authority over the welfare of others. That same mindset allowed you to rationalize stealing money that was supposed to benefit your community." Judge Holloway sentenced Patricia to 5 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 3 years. She also ordered full restitution of the $73,000 plus interest, and permanently banned Patricia from serving in any fiduciary capacity. Patricia's face crumpled as the sentence was read, and she was led out of the courtroom by bailiffs. The sentence felt like justice, though nothing could fully compensate for the chaos and stress Patricia had caused. The HOA did eventually recover most of the stolen money through a combination of Patricia's assets being seized and claims against her homeowner's insurance policy, which covered certain types of fraud by board members. Life in Pinewood Estates moved on. Robert served effectively as president for another year before stepping down to focus on his business. Jennifer took over and continued the common-sense approach to HOA governance. The block heater incident became part of neighborhood lore, a cautionary tale about what happens when petty authority goes unchecked. As for me, I continued to live in Pinewood Estates and drive my diesel truck. Every winter morning, I plug in my engine block heater without any concern about violation notices or fines. The familiar hum of the heater warming my engine is a reminder that sometimes standing up to unreasonable authority is not just about personal convenience. It is about protecting the basic functionality of a community and ensuring that rules serve people rather than the other way around. The whole experience taught me several important lessons. First, HOA rules need to make practical sense for the actual environment where people live. A regulation that might be reasonable in Arizona could be absurd in North Dakota, and anyone enforcing rules needs to understand that context matters. Second, community leadership should be about service, not power. Patricia saw her position as president as a way to control others and enrich herself. Robert saw it as a way to help neighbors and improve the community. The difference in outcome speaks for itself. Third, people need to speak up when something is wrong, even if it is uncomfortable. If everyone had just accepted Patricia's block heater ban without complaint, she would have continued finding new ways to assert her authority and cause problems. By pushing back, even when it was inconvenient and frustrating, we eventually exposed not just a bad policy, but actual criminal behavior. The story spread beyond Pinewood Estates. Local news outlets picked it up, and then some national media ran features about the HOA president who banned engine block heaters and ended up in prison for embezzlement. The coverage sparked conversations about HOA governance, the need for oversight, and the importance of community members staying engaged with their associations. Several other HOAs in Fargo reached out to Robert for advice on improving their governance structures. He helped them implement resident advisory committees, transparent financial reporting, and common-sense review processes for rule enforcement. The reforms that came out of our experience with Patricia ended up benefiting communities throughout the area. I also learned that vindication can be satisfying, but what matters more is positive change. Seeing Patricia sentenced to prison felt good in the moment, but what really mattered was that Pinewood Estates became a better place to live. The community was more connected, more engaged, and more willing to work together to solve problems. We had weathered both a literal and figurative cold snap, and we came out stronger on the other side. One interesting footnote to the whole story involved the diesel truck owners who had been most affected by the block heater ban. We formed an informal group that met occasionally for barbecues and to discuss vehicle maintenance and cold weather preparation. It was not anything official, just a few guys who had bonded over shared frustration with HOA nonsense. We called ourselves the Frozen Engine Club, and we made it our mission to help new residents understand the realities of North Dakota winters. Every fall, before the first serious cold snap, we would organize a community workshop on winter vehicle preparation. We showed people how to use block heaters and battery warmers, explained the importance of winter-grade oil and antifreeze, and demonstrated proper techniques for starting cold engines. It became one of the most popular community events, drawing both long-time residents and newcomers who appreciated the practical advice. The workshop was always held in the community center, and we made sure to tell the story of the block heater ban as a cautionary tale and a bit of entertainment. People loved hearing about Patricia's downfall, and it served as a useful reminder about the importance of practical, community-focused HOA leadership. My relationship with HOAs permanently changed after the Patricia Henderson experience. I became much more engaged with board meetings and community decisions. I ran for the board myself after Jennifer stepped down as president, serving for 2 years as treasurer. It was often tedious work, reviewing budgets and approving routine expenditures, but it was also important. By staying involved, I could help ensure that Pinewood Estates never again fell under the control of someone like Patricia. During my time on the board, we implemented several reforms that became models for other HOAs. We created a rule review committee that evaluated all regulations every 2 years to identify outdated or impractical provisions. We established a quick appeal process for residents who received violation notices, allowing them to present their case to the board before fines were imposed. We also instituted term limits for board positions to prevent any one person from accumulating too much power. These changes were not revolutionary, just common-sense governance that put community welfare ahead of bureaucratic rigidity. But they made a real difference in how people experienced living in Pinewood Estates. Violation notices decreased dramatically because we focused on actual problems rather than technical infractions. Community satisfaction increased, and several residents who had been considering moving away decided to stay. The financial recovery from Patricia's theft took longer than the initial investigation and trial. Even with restitution ordered by the court and insurance payouts, the HOA had to carefully manage its budget for over a year to fully replenish the depleted reserves. We delayed some planned improvements and negotiated better rates with service providers. The community pulled together, with residents voting to approve a temporary special assessment to help cover the shortfall. People were willing to pay a little extra because they trusted that the money would actually be used for community benefit, not diverted into someone's pocket. I stayed in regular contact with Robert Martinez and Jennifer White even after my term on the board ended. We had formed genuine friendships through the crisis and its aftermath. Robert's business continued to thrive, and he became something of a local expert on HOA governance, occasionally speaking at community association conferences about the lessons learned from the Pinewood Estates experience. Jennifer eventually moved to a different city for a job opportunity, but she stayed connected to the community and would visit whenever she was back in Fargo. As years passed, new residents moved into Pinewood Estates who had not lived through the block heater saga. They heard the story as neighborhood legend, sometimes skeptical that an HOA president would really ban such an obviously necessary piece of equipment. Those of us who had been there would pull up the old Facebook posts and news articles to prove that, yes, it really happened. And yes, it was every bit as absurd as it sounded. The story became a teaching tool not just within our community, but for HOAs across cold weather climates. I was invited to speak at a statewide community association conference about resident rights and the importance of questioning unreasonable rules. My presentation focused on practical strategies for addressing HOA overreach, from documenting communications to building coalitions with other affected residents, to knowing when to escalate issues to the full board or even legal authorities. One of the most gratifying aspects of speaking about the experience was hearing from other people who had faced similar situations. After one presentation, a woman approached me with tears in her eyes. She lived in a different HOA that had been trying to ban residents from parking work vehicles in their driveways, which would have prevented her husband, a plumber, from making a living. She had been fighting the policy alone and feeling overwhelmed. After hearing my story, she felt encouraged to keep pushing back and to organize other affected residents. She later emailed to tell me that they had successfully overturned the ban, and the board president who had proposed it had resigned under pressure. These stories reminded me that the battle against petty tyranny and bureaucratic overreach is ongoing. There will always be people who get a taste of authority and abuse it, but there will also always be people willing to stand up and say that rules should serve communities, not control them. The key is making sure the latter group outnumbers the former and stays engaged enough to prevent problems before they escalate. My truck, the 2020 Ford F-250 diesel that had inadvertently started this whole saga, continued to serve me faithfully. Every winter morning, the block heater hummed away, warming the engine and ensuring reliable starts even in the worst weather. I never took that simple piece of equipment for granted again. What had once been a mundane bit of vehicle maintenance had become a symbol of common sense prevailing over arbitrary authority. The parking spot next to my assigned space, where the electrical outlet was located, eventually got a small plaque installed by the HOA board. It read, "In memory of common sense, may it always prevail." It was Jennifer's idea, implemented just before she moved away. The plaque made me smile every time I saw it, a permanent reminder that even small acts of resistance can lead to meaningful change. Patricia Henderson served 3 years and 4 months of her 5-year sentence before being released on parole. She did not return to Fargo after her release, moving instead to somewhere in Minnesota, where presumably no one knew her story. I occasionally wondered if she ever reflected on how differently things could have gone if she had simply listened to reason about the block heaters, or if she had viewed her role as president as a service opportunity rather than a chance to assert dominance. But ultimately, her fate was not my concern. She had faced consequences for her actions, and the community had moved on to better leadership. The final piece of the story came about 5 years after the initial block heater incident. The original HOA regulations, the ones that Patricia had misinterpreted to ban block heaters, were completely rewritten by a committee of residents and board members. The new regulations were half as long, twice as clear, and focused exclusively on issues that actually affected community welfare and property values. Maintenance of essential vehicle equipment was explicitly protected. Common sense exceptions were built into every rule. And most importantly, the regulations included a provision requiring board members to consider the practical impact of any enforcement action before issuing violations. The process of rewriting the regulations involved months of community meetings, surveys, and feedback sessions. It was tedious work, but it was also deeply satisfying. We were building something better, creating a framework for community governance that would serve residents rather than burden them. The final document was approved by an overwhelming majority of homeowners and became a model that other HOAs requested permission to adapt for their own communities. On the day the new regulations were officially adopted, the board held a small celebration at the community center. About 50 residents attended, including several of the diesel truck owners who had been most affected by the original block heater ban. Robert gave a short speech about the journey from crisis to reform, acknowledging the pain and frustration of the initial conflict while celebrating the positive changes that had emerged. "We learned that rules without reason are just tyranny wearing a bureaucratic mask," Robert said. "We learned that community leadership is a privilege that requires humility and a genuine desire to serve. And we learned that ordinary people standing up for common sense can create extraordinary change. Aaron, this started because you refused to accept an unreasonable rule. Thank you for having the courage to push back." People applauded, and I felt a mix of embarrassment and pride. I had not set out to become some kind of HOA reform advocate. I just wanted to keep my truck running during winter. But sometimes the most significant changes come from the most mundane conflicts, and sometimes the best outcomes emerge from the worst situations. As I drove home that evening, my truck running smoothly thanks to the engine block heater that was now explicitly protected by HOA regulations, I reflected on everything that had happened. A simple piece of vehicle equipment had exposed corruption, changed community governance, and ultimately led to criminal prosecution and meaningful reform. It was a reminder that every rule, every regulation, every exercise of authority affects real people living real lives. Those in positions of power have a responsibility to remember that basic truth. The cold North Dakota winters continue to come every year, as reliable as taxes and as harsh as ever. But the residents of Pinewood Estates faced them with better equipment, better leadership, and better community solidarity. We had learned our lessons through a crisis of Patricia Henderson's making, and we had emerged stronger, smarter, and more committed to ensuring that common sense would always have a place in our community governance. Years later, when new neighbors would move in and ask about the plaque by my parking spot, I would tell them the whole story. Some found it funny, others found it outrageous, but everyone appreciated the lesson. Rules are tools, not weapons. Leadership is service, not dominion. And community is built by people who care enough to speak up when something is wrong, even when it is uncomfortable, even when it is inconvenient, and even when it is just about something as simple as an engine block heater on a diesel truck in the frozen heart of North Dakota.